Good morning or good afternoon, depending on your location today. We are very excited here at Goliath to have George Spears join us on this webinar to discuss how to troubleshoot Citrix's flow, and often proving that the root cause isn't Citrix at all, but another element within the infrastructure or remote worker behavior, especially with everybody working from their home offices. For those that do not know George is currently a Citrix Technical Professional CTP. By day, he is a Citrix architect for an enterprise organization in the UK. He has a number of certifications, including being a Citrix certified expert in virtualization and networking. He's also a Microsoft certified solution expert, and most recently gained his certification as a Client Epic System Administrator. So George, welcome. We are extremely excited to have you today. In terms of the agenda, we're going to talk a little bit, actually George is, around what are the challenges that many Citrix administrators and architects face on a daily basis as they try to troubleshoot root cause around poor slow session performance, slow logons, as well as reporting around Citrix end user activity and productivity. If you have questions, please submit them in the chat box. We will try to answer them throughout. And those that we do not answer, we will direct at the very end of the presentation. So please provide those in the chat. And also, one of the questions we often get is, will this be recorded? Yes, within the 24 hours, you will have a copy of this recording in your inbox to review or to share with your colleagues. Also on the call today, we have Yemi Ladyju, who's our senior technical consultant, and she'll be providing some demonstrations around the technology. And my name is Stacy Leidwinger. I'm here in the marketing department. And before I turn it to George, I'm just going to give one slide of a brief introduction to Goliath for those who are not familiar with us. So at Goliath, we offer troubleshooting and monitoring software for the end user experience that has embedded intelligence and automation that allows you to anticipate, troubleshoot, and document end user performance issues. We deliver this software across industries, as you can see, for all companies of sizes from SMBs to large enterprises. We also have a stronghold in healthcare. The reason for that is we have both technical and business partnerships with all the major EMR, EHR vendors like Cerner, Epic, Meditech, and Allscripts. One of the things is, though, despite what size organization or how many users, the same thing comes back time and time again from our customers. They tell us when they use Goliath, it's as if they've hired 2 to 3 full-time troubleshooting experts that are constantly available and are identifying issues and resolving them before end users are even impacted. So one of the things that George will probably hit on today is there are not enough experts often to cover the demand and need, especially with the surge of remote working. And that's where Goliath's embedded intelligence and automation can help. And in order to serve the needs, we scale both technically and economically to fit all needs, really delivering end-to-end visibility across the entire delivery infrastructure, as well as end user behavior, and then for healthcare across those major EHR systems. Now, with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to George, who's going to talk a lot about probably many of the challenges many of you on the phone today are facing, and how some of those challenges have even been magnified with the surge of remote working due to the pandemic. George, welcome today, and I'll let you take over.
Thank you, Stacey, and thanks again for having me here today. So as we get started, if you're a fellow Citrix administrator like me, you will have heard the following questions many times, some actually almost daily. So like, why are my logons taking so long? Why can't I connect to my apps? What applications are my end users using? How do we know if our users have good performance or bad performance? And probably the most confusing one, in my opinion anyway, why is Citrix slow? So answering these questions aren't actually as straightforward as they may read on paper. You see there's 3 things in particular that stand out, and these are reasons why they are actually challenging questions to answer. So firstly, the delivery infrastructure required for a Citrix environment is complex. You probably are well aware of that fact. You have the network infrastructure, which is made up of switches, firewalls, routers, and so on, basically to get traffic from A to B. You have the storage, hypervisor compute, and then all the virtualization layer that consists of virtual machines and networks and so on. And we also have the core infrastructure components such as Active Directory, group policy, DNS, DHCP, all the stuff you're pretty used to in a day-to-day environment. And all of these components constantly interact with each other. And like most enterprise solutions, Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktops is dependent on all of them to be working effectively. So if there's a component between the end user and their virtual application or desktop that is lacking or lagging behind, the end user is likely going to be asking those questions. Why is Citrix slow? Why can I not access my apps? Or those other types of questions highlighted in the previous slide. So this leads me on to the second point. There is a shortage of Citrix and VMware Horizon experts. EUC isn't straightforward to get right, and there is a lot of planning and consideration that needs to go into virtual apps or desktops deployment. So to get the best out of your deployment, you need to know the product inside out and the many different components that surround it. EUC is sensitive, so there is configuration that needs to keep the end user experience in mind at all times. And this is often where the breakdown is. Because it's difficult to find the experts, this also often leads to Citrix experts spending time firefighting help desk tickets rather than dedicating time on managing and improving the Citrix and VMware environment. And then finally, the third point is the free monitoring tools are not as effective as the business needs. So purpose-built monitoring tools or solutions are required, and these basically give Citrix administrators and help desk staff the right information to pinpoint issues before they impact end users, or the right information to troubleshoot end user tickets quicker with minimal effort. Could we just go back one slide, please? Thanks. So as I mentioned, in this slide, you'll see that a Citrix environment is in particular complex. And we as Citrix administrators need in-depth knowledge to support it. So from the left of this diagram, we have our end users that are initiating ICA connections to their virtual apps and desktops. And these end users come from multiple locations. They literally could come from anywhere in the world. We have a lot of users now working remotely from home due to the pandemic, but there are more people that head back to the HQ and branch offices. And all these users use different devices, from home PCs to corporate laptops or to personal mobile devices. The location and device complexity right away presents opportunities for help desk tickets to be logged due to slowness within applications or logons when working remotely, or access issues because a BYOD device is missing Citrix Workspace app, or the user is running an old operating system that is running poorly, which is causing the end user to think Citrix is slow, when in fact it's actually something on the user side. And also add to the fact that personal devices are not controlled by IT, and this makes it difficult to troubleshoot and pinpoint why end user experience is impacted. Then moving to the right of this diagram and into the data center, we have the core Citrix components. So things like your Citrix gateway, your storefront servers, the delivery controllers, and then our virtual application and desktop VMs. And then onto backend systems. So things like your profile servers, Active Directory, SQL databases, licensing servers. And these all sit on a range of hypervisors that are connected via the data center network. And it's clear to see by just discussing this over the space of 1 to 2 minutes, there's many different components needed to make this work. And also they're all managed by different teams, like the network team, the storage team, and so on. And it's also prudent to mention that, of course, public cloud consumption is also on the rise. So you may have a hybrid deployment with desktops or application servers hosted in Azure, AWS, or Google Cloud, for example. And this further, expands the components at play within your infrastructure and presents different challenges when it comes to troubleshooting and supporting our end user base. So I touched on how it is difficult to find Citrix experts, and I definitely see an offset, at least in my location, between demand for Citrix expertise versus the pool of experts available in the market. So when we look at a typical Citrix environment, you could predict that 2 to 3 Citrix experts would be the ideal amount of people to keep the environment healthy, effective, and up to date. A lot of time, the Citrix expert is deploying and configuring the operating system, the applications, group policy, profile servers, load balancing, and more. So they're not just doing one thing, they're doing multiple different things across different systems. And Citrix expertise is in demand. Yet a lot of times, as I've mentioned, Citrix experts can spend 25 to 30% of their time troubleshooting basic end user tickets. And this takes away the true value of their skill sets. And there are, of course, other ways to help alleviate the expertise. So striving to have the wider IT team skilled up on Citrix products is one way that you can help the Citrix expert. And the deployment configuration as much as possible is essential so that these users know how to support Citrix in an effective manner. The other option is to employ a purpose-built monitoring solution. And basically that solution should be able to anticipate issues before they happen, using things like threshold-based alerting, basically to detect when something's not performing correctly, and automated testing, not just of your Citrix infrastructure, but the other pieces I mentioned previously in the slides previous, such as DNS and Active Directory, those core components that play their part in a successful deployment. We also want a solution that can troubleshoot the environment by displaying session information in real time that can help pinpoint where a problem is occurring. So deep and broad metric collection that helps reduce the amount of time you spend wondering where exactly a problem does lie. And then of course, a solution that assists with the documentation. So here you can document the root cause to make way for permanent fixes and also to generate a knowledge base for solutions found to common issues. All of this documentation can also be shared with your management teams as proof that you've provided a root cause analysis and fix to an issue, or to third-party teams under the example where maybe a problem is not caused by Citrix itself and it actually has to be resolved by a third party. So moving on, let's take a look at the typical day experienced by a Citrix administrator. So a remote user logs an incident with the desk complaining of slow Citrix performance since working from home. And this is a difficult one to troubleshoot because you don't own the network, you don't own the user's network, you do not have any visibility into that network. You don't know the speed of the network, how strong the wireless signal is if the user is using Wi-Fi, or what else is going on inside of that network. For example, maybe another member of the household is streaming films using YouTube or Netflix, or playing online games. Basically, there are other devices and people that are contending for that bandwidth. Add to the fact that a lot of people now work from home and the usage of apps like Zoom and Teams, which can consume a lot of bandwidth, has increased tenfold. You also don't control the device. If BYOD is allowed and users are allowed to log in remotely with their personal devices, that device could be running slow in general. Maybe it's lacking RAM or CPU, it could be 6 years old or 7 years old, or there could be lots of miscellaneous software installed. It's really making it run quite poorly. If the laptop is slow, there will be a knock-on effects when using Citrix. However, the end user that logs a ticket with you saying Citrix is slow, they may not declare that their device is slow. So you're led down the path that the issue is with Citrix rather than it being the end user's device. So off you go, spending time trying to figure out if other users working from home are having similar issues. So the user is connecting from home via Citrix Gateway. So you may check the gateway for things like high packet engine usage or bandwidth. You may also include the network team to see if there's any bottleneck on the WAN connection coming into the data center. You will check the VDA that the user is logged into for things like high RAM or CPU. And you'll also try and find out if there is any data center network latency or if the user's WAN latency is high. And this requires other products such as Citrix ADM to be able to track those latency metrics. So basically, as you can probably tell, all of these checks will consume a lot of your time, and there is simply no guarantee you will end up with a resolution, especially if the issue lies within the end user's network or device that you don't have that visibility into. So as such, to combat this, basically having a purpose-built tool that will allow you to make the judgment much quicker. because it's already been proactively monitoring your entire environment for any abnormalities. So at this stage, I'd like to bring in Yemi. Would you like to explain in some more detail, please?
Absolutely. And George, I think that, that to your point, these are all of these sort of checklist items that someone that is sort of in charge of troubleshooting user experience will have to do in order to understand exactly what's causing their session to be slow. And what we found is, when customers deploy our technology, the technology is automatically looking for a lot of these things, and then it presents it here in a single view to allow you to sort of troubleshoot quickly. So let's take, for instance, a user's calling in, complaining about slowness inside of their session. Our customers will quickly flip over to this section here. This is the Citrix virtual apps and desktop session display. And this is where all of the sessions in the environment will populate. So you can see the app servers, published applications to desktops, even VDI if you have that available in your environment. And when we talk about embedded intelligence, the technology is going to be looking for, users that are having sustained latency inside of their session or a long log-on time. And it can alert you to these things even before users start to complain about them. Another thing to point out as sort of a differentiating factor and something that is very useful when it comes to troubleshooting is the ability to go back historically with the same amount of granularity. So we don't average or roll up any information we collect here. So if I wanted to go back and see historic sessions from 3 weeks ago, from a month ago, depending on how long I want to keep the data for, that's actually available. So I can go back and see the same amount of granularity in a session from today as I would from a session from 2 months ago. But let's focus on this particular scenario, right? A user's calling in, complaining about slowness. I can quickly search for the user, identify their session, and then click down on the session. And right away, as soon as I click on them, I have a view, a pop-up here of about 7 tabs that breaks down everything that went into the user session, aligned to the time frame of the session, as well as giving me detailed core metrics, as George mentioned, which are important and enable you to come up with the answer as to what's causing slowness. So we actually had a customer that I think last year, before the pandemic, they were implementing a work from home initiative where users were they could either bring their own devices or they could leverage sort of iGel thin clients to be able to, do their insurance company. So to get on and with customers and, file claims, so on and so forth. What they found is that users, as soon as they implemented this environment, users were always complaining about slowness and poor connections, especially when they're using their Cisco soft phones inside of their session. So they deployed our technology, and they were able to then isolate the sessions that were impacted. And then from here, which is the summary tab, which pretty much summarizes all of these other tabs, they were able to quickly identify in a couple of clicks what exactly was impacting the poor sessions. And their workflow is pretty simple. Look at the round trip time here, which is the, sort of an accurate depiction of whether or not a user is actually having a problem or not. So you can see here, and of course, in most environments, any round trip time that is sustained over 450 milliseconds is actually going to be apparent to the user. So you can see here, they would head over to the round trip time, expand that, and confirm, okay, it looks like this user is actually having a problem. But as George mentioned, there are a lot of different things that impact the user experience. So we want to understand, is it coming from a resource problem, so something within the data center, or is it coming from a network perspective, which is either it's a network between the maybe the NetScaler and the VDA, or something from the user's location. How you identify that is by looking here at network latency. This is real-time network latency, not a ping-based or ICMP-based or, let's say, test package or something like that. This is actually the network latency that Citrix is calculating on its own to determine how to deliver a better experience to this user. So our technology integrates with the ICA protocol, pulls this metric out, and tells you specifically whether or not the round trip time, the poor round trip time, is actually a network related issue, or is it something coming from within the environment. So here you can quickly see, all right, it looks like for the most part, network latency is actually driving the poor round trip time. So, and just by looking at these two charts, we can get rid of, or we can sort of rule out the virtual environment, the inside of the data center as being the root cause of the problem, and not have to go through all of those checklists and things like that. From that perspective, we've been able to identify that it's an actually network problem. And then to take it further, we can actually look here at connection speed. And this is the amount of bandwidth available for the Workspace app or Citrix receiver at the user's endpoint location. So this is effectively their download speed at their location. And what this tells us is whether or not poor download speed or poor connectivity at this user's location is actually the root cause of the problem. And if we look here on this session, you can actually see that this user has a very inconsistent network. And at the points where it's low, it is very low. We're talking about 2 megabits per second, 1 megabit per second, which really isn't enough to have a good Citrix session. So if I was troubleshooting this particular scenario with this user, I'm able to tell that this is actually a problem from the user's location and not actually a problem from the data center, and rule out all of these other components as being the root cause. I can even take it further, and this insurance company did the same thing, drilling into here the ICA HCX channel tab. And here it gives you more details about some of the things that we talked about: ICA latency, network latency, round trip time, the connection speed that the user has at their location. You can also troubleshoot the user's behavior. So here, in this particular insurance company, they were using Cisco soft phones, as I mentioned. And what they found was that when users weren't using their soft phones, they had a good session. But as soon as they started to see audio bandwidth spike here, and this is the ICA channel breakdown, where it breaks down all of the different available channels that are being used inside of the session and the amount of bandwidth that is being used at any point in time. So what they saw was that as their sessions, they had enough sort of internal bandwidth to support regular sessions, but when users started having audio bandwidth spiking, which is indicative of them using their soft phone inside of their VDI, that the network couldn't support that. So they not only were able to troubleshoot poor sessions and sort of point to the user's location as being the root cause of the problem, but they were also able to use the technology to collaborate with their network team and say, hey, we need more bandwidth allocated to the environment to be able to support the audio usage inside of the sessions. So really quickly, that's how we would be able to use this technology to troubleshoot very, very quickly issues when it comes to Citrix being slow. So I have a sort of a natural screenshot or sort of slideshow from this customer environment that sort of details exactly the steps that they went through. So they went through the user sessions, they isolated the sessions that they were looking for, they looked at the summary tab, and upon drilling into here, which is the ICA channel, here's an actual screenshot we got from the customer showing a spike in network latency and round trip time, as well as ICA latency inside of a session, directly correlated to a drop in connection speed at a particular point. So they were able to ask this user, hey, what's going on? What was happening at 3 p.m. at your house? Because that's when you started having issues. Well, it turns out that at 3 p.m., everyone got back home from work, they got on the network, and that actually crushed the bandwidth available for this user session, and that's actually what caused the slowness. So with that, I'll pass it over to George again to talk about sort of the next scenario and how we would be able to troubleshoot those issues.
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, so the next scenario I want to cover is slow logons. Slow logons are one of the most common complaints you will hear from your end users, and it's also one of the most critical end user experience factors, right? So a deployment of virtual apps and desktops, I would wager a bet that slow logons or fast slow logons is one of top of the mind for Citrix administrators. So how do you go about troubleshooting slow logon times? So obviously, and unfortunately, slow logons are far from obvious. Otherwise, we would probably never have them. We spend a lot of time configuring our environment to drive down logon times, but there are environmental factors that can throw logon times in the opposite direction of where we want them to go. And how I like to begin is looking for any consistencies, any patterns to the slowness. So if it's occurring on a specific application or desktop for specific users from a certain area or location, or is there slowness across the board? And if it's slowness across the board, you might start by looking at things within your data center where your apps and desktops are hosted. If the slowness is coming from a certain location, you would concentrate on that area. Or maybe it is a remote office and a network issue there is causing high latency or packet loss. Other things you may look at in general surround group policy and user profiles. So these items are frequent culprits of slow logons. Things to do with to investigate these issues are to check event viewer on the machine to see if there are any issues with group policy processing or the user profile. You can also refer to logging. So if you're using Citrix profile management, for example, you might simply try logging on yourself to see if there are any, you're receiving the same slowness. Also check the RAM and CPU usage across your hypervisors or virtual machines. So maybe a particular hypervisor is overloaded and it happens to be that your affected users are connected to desktops on this overloaded hypervisor. Or maybe it's the virtual machine itself. Maybe it's struggling. Maybe there's too many users logged on, or there's a particular user who is running a process that is running at high CPU levels. Examples of overloaded VDAs can come into play also when some VDAs are powered off or in an unregistered state with their delivery controller. So obviously if I have 100 VDAs for my users and maybe for some reason 20 are unregistered, obviously that creates a lot of contention for the 80 remaining VDAs that are available to serve my end users. Other things you can do is to check with the network team for any latency, and this can be latency from the user's network to the VDA in the data center. Run some checks against your domain controllers to make sure they're not impacting logon. If a domain controller is performing poorly, this can impact authentication and obviously your group policy processing as well, which is a critical part of the logon process. And then finally, make sure your virtual machines are optimized. So you can use the Citrix Optimizer tool from Citrix to turn off unneeded scheduled tasks, disable Windows services, and perform some other tweaks to the virtual machine, which literally makes it leaner. There's more stuff running, or sorry, there's less stuff running on there, so there's more resource to basically handle user load and user logons. Throughout this investigation, but I've touched on, you've had to engage with your network team for latency, your hypervisor team to check for RAM and CPU usage, and also your Active Directory teams to see if there are any issues with the Active Directory servers. And maybe you've even had to talk to the EUC team who may manage the operating systems on your VDAs. So having to bounce off all these multiple different teams, it's further increased the time it takes to troubleshoot slow logons and find a resolution for your users. So again, having a purpose-built monitoring tool can help avoid this by basically providing you with in-depth health and performance data for your entire infrastructure. And again, this isn't just Citrix pieces, this is also the pieces that make Citrix work, and that's your Active Directory and other core components that I've mentioned before. Yemi, do you want to go into a bit more detail around that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. And George, I think that this checklist is pretty consistent with what we see. You know, some of customers and prospective customers go through when it comes to troubleshooting issues. And I think this sort of reminds me of a particular customer that we had. They were a large Epic Health system in the Midwest, and they actually were having, log on time spiking up to about 200, 300 seconds, which really isn't good, especially when we're talking about healthcare. So, when they deployed the technology, they sort of went through the same workflow as we did in the first scenario, which is isolating the user session and then drilling into them. But before we go into that, there's a couple of things that they were able to benefit from with the technology. The first thing is that embedded intelligence, looking for unregistered machines, looking for machines that or a hypervisor hosts that are you could say running hot or having poor resource utilization at any point in time, and sort of aligning that and being able to be aware of those things before they start to impact users. But when, let's say, a user is actually impacted, they still had the ability to drill down into the user session and again take a look at everything that went into the performance of this user session. Now, of course, we talked about the summary tab and how important that is for troubleshooting in-session performance. But there is a dedicated Logon tab here, which customers can flip over to and view everything that went into the performance of this user's logon. So, and this page really is broken down into two sections. You have the top section breaking down what's going on during the brokering stages of the logon process. So what's happening at the delivery controller, like drive mapping, printer mapping, session startup time from a sort of brokering perspective. But you can also see what's happening at Citrix receiver or the workspace app. And this is without deploying any technology to the user's endpoint. We're able to see things like ICA file download, or how long it took to establish the micro VPN connection. How long did it take for those startup processes to take place at the user's location? This gives you insight into whether or not the user needs to upgrade their version. If ICA file download takes a long time, you know that it's probably a connection issue. So giving you that additional insight allows you to pinpoint where exactly during the brokering process issues are taking place. But then you can also drill down here into the bottom section, which is going to break down everything happening within the data center at the session host. So seeing things like brokering and client and server validation, being able to see expand authentication and see what OUs this user is a part of, what domain controller was in charge of authenticating the session, how long it took for those LDAP calls to take place. Expanded a GPO section where you could see each individual group policy that affected the session down to the policy name and how long each one took. So you can identify those problem GPOs very quickly. And that's sort of exactly what was happening for this large health system. They were able to take a look at a user session. They found out that the GPO processing time was taking up about 180 seconds of the logon process. And upon drilling into it, they found that they were mapping sessions to a drive that had been decommissioned. So it was a quick fix at that point, which means just remove that policy and cut down the logon time. And so that's really sort of how quick and easy it is to identify some of these things. Now, to George's point, there are typically a lot more things that impact the user session, right? So having all of those components aligned to the time frame of the session allows you to do some more troubleshooting without even having to involve other teams and things like that. So the first thing that I wanted to point out is we also estimate the bandwidth connection for the users for the logon process. So to understand, is it slow or fast? That gives you some insight into what's actually adding some delays there. But we also have the VM resources for the time frame of the session here. So if the VM was having some problems, you'd be able to identify that here, as well as the hypervisor host resource utilization as well, where you can not only see the host resources, you can also see what data stores are attached and what other VMs are being supported by that host. So maybe everything from a brokering perspective looks pretty good. However, that VM or the session host is actually being supported by a hypervisor host that is really, really poor when it comes to resource utilization. And that's actually causing those slownesses and the delays inside of their session. So basically everything that, George was talking about checking when it comes to the users, when it comes to a user having long logons, are all available in one single view for the user session. And then with additional details went into the group policies, authentication, so that if at any point there's some sort of slowness within this user's logon process, you're able to quickly identify that in minutes rather than hours, or maybe even days. So with that, I actually have a screenshot of this large health systems product showing how they were able to use this technology to quickly identify the root cause of a logon issue. So as you can see here, this is a screenshot of their logon process. You can see over 280 seconds with the logon process, most of that within the profile load. And on expanding the GPO section, they found specifically the policy that was impacting that the most. They were able to remediate that and cut down the times drastically. So with that, we'll pass it over to George to talk about the next scenario.
Yep, thanks again, Yemi. And I really like the dedicated Logon tab that you displayed, and it literally breaks down, even to the level of how long did it take for my ICA file to download. So, it's very granular. It's very good information to have when you're troubleshooting a common issue that you probably face, if not daily, definitely weekly, from your end users. So guys, lastly, something that is asked much more from management today relates to the end user experience. So due to the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously a large portion of staff now work from home and continue to do so. Also, many organizations are actually looking to make home working a much more frequent thing, even permanent. And this poses some fresh challenges for organizations, as they need to ensure that their employees have the right tools to be productive, even when outside of the office. So even when providing the right tools, though, how do we know that our end users are getting the best out of them? Are they receiving a good user experience when using these business apps? That is what management are now concerned about, because they want to know if their employees are receiving an acceptable end user experience in order to be productive when working from home. And this also leads to other questions being asked, such as how many people are logging on from home, or what are the concurrent numbers at certain periods of the day. How many users are using our corporate VPN solution versus our BYOD solution that may be running from Citrix Gateway as an ICA proxy? What applications are users accessing and when? What sort of performance are our users receiving? What users are experiencing high latency or network issues? And what can we do to help reduce this number, right? What is the average latency and how can we drive latency down across the board? And then, how many Citrix licenses are being checked out? So some end users may not have used Citrix whilst in the office on their physical desktop, but now they use Citrix remotely to access virtual applications, or they might use a product like Remote PC, for example. For these reasons, management want to make sure that license counts are not breached, and they can track consumption rates to identify any trends that require actions, such as maybe additional license procurement. So again, purpose-built monitoring products that can capture and report on such data makes answering all of these questions easier. And also it makes it easier for everyone involved to run a successful virtual apps and desktops deployment for our remote workers, and also keep management in the know. So on that basis, Yemi, could you provide some more detail around this, please?
Absolutely, George. And I think, you've sort of summarized the things that management would like to see in a really good way, because it really allows us to focus on the conversation of data, right? So there's, you have a lot of data, there's a lot of information on different portions of the environment. And it is important that, especially from a management perspective, that you're able to share the data with management and any other tools, and any other teams, whether that's exporting to CSV, to the PDFs and things like that. You're able to integrate the data, so using all of these tools and alerting and things like that to drive alerts and drive sort of collaborative conversations with other team members, or even enabling help desk to be able to solve issues quickly. And then finally, being able to enhance the data to create more robust reporting so that management can view these things and make decisions based on these sort of based on the metrics that you have available to you. And I think that's exactly, you know, how our customers sort of go about this. So out of the box in our technology, we have a lot of data available in a number of different reports. And you can sort of break them down into end user performance, end user activity, as well as sort of the system and back end system performance of the environment. And I think for today, we're going to focus on a couple of these reports that are some of our most popular reports that customers are leveraging on a day-to-day basis to either share the data, to integrate with other tools, as well as to enhance them and make real-time decisions. So the first one we're going to talk about is the Logon duration report. So we talked earlier and we've showed the amount of data that's available. And I know a lot of our customers like to leverage this Logon duration report because it breaks down all of the users in the environment for a particular time period, and it shows the different stages of the logon process for the user. So it's not just the overall logon times, but the different sort of sub-stages, which allows IT to make those decisions on what to tackle next. Are GPOs too high? What technologies can we implement to actually remediate or lower those? Profile sizes or profile loads might be too high. What can we do to solve that? Either that's deploying technology to our file servers to alert us before files are getting too high, or implementing other technologies that could be impacting that. So having this visibility allows those decisions to be made from an IT perspective as to what actually is impacting the user's experience, or particularly the logon process in this case, and how you can go about remediating that and bringing it down. The next report then is when we're talking about enhancing the data. This is a really good example. This report here breaks down logon times, and this is one where someone leveraged a view that we have for Power BI. And they are able to break down the logon times for a particular location as for a period of time, as well as break down the sub-stages of the environment. I know this was used to show management the improvements that were made into the environment when a particular customer actually deprecated some old hosts and really just focused on using their more newer and more powerful hypervisor hosts, which then meant that users were having a better experience. They were able to show that to justify that action. The next report I know is something that has been very, very popular, especially now that users are working from home, which is the end user productivity report. This report breaks down the users, it breaks down their IP address or how they're connecting in, what components, whether that's their NetScaler or storefront, that they use to access the environment, their session start date, their duration of their sessions, the amount of time that they are spending creating ICA traffic, so interacting inside of their session. Conversely, the amount of time that they're not active, their interaction percentage, and then the max inactivity time, which is the maximum amount of time within that session that they were inactive. A lot of our customers use this to understand not only if users are working, of course, but more importantly, to understand what does the sort of normal work hours look like now for users as they're working from home. I know one of our customers, Empire Office, found that users were actually not only working more often, but they're working sort of disparately across the along the entire day. So maybe a user logs in at about 6 a.m. before their kids wake up, and then logs out at 12 to homeschooling, so on and so forth, and then working into the later hours of the night. And so having this ability, this visibility, allows management to understand users are working, and if they're not working, you have the ability to understand why they're not working. Maybe it's because their connections have been really poor from home, and they just get frustrated inside of their environment as they're working as they're working in their Citrix sessions. So this type of information, especially to management, has been very helpful to understand how the environment has changed during this sort of work from home era that we're in today. George, in your experience, would any of these reports be helpful or useful to in gaining visibility into some of these aspects of the environment?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's something that I see requested more often from management is end user productivity type reports. You know, how many people have been logged on, what applications they're using, you know, what's been their interaction with the applications and desktops, and yeah, sort of touched on that previously as well. Just I think management are more concerned, you know, if people are working from home, are they still able to be productive, and are they getting a good user experience? So yeah, absolutely.
Exactly, and I think that that's consistent with what we're hearing as well. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Stacy, and so Stacy can wrap us up.
Well, thanks, Yemi and George. That was a great session, and we do have some questions coming in. If there's others, please type them in, and we'll get to them. One question we often get, especially after Yemi's demos, is how long would it take to get up and running? And one of the things that we're able to do with our white glove service is get customers up and running in 2 hours or less. So you will have a senior technical consultant help walk you through the install process. We then have a number of out-of-the-box reports and alerts that you can set up and that are available for immediate use, just like the report you saw from Yemi. The other big thing is we've talked about this embedded intelligence and automation. This means that you don't have to be an expert to use the product to understand the different troubleshooting workflows. We have a number of customers that use this with their level 1 help desk support, and several of those customers have students that are either their summer intern jobs or even a university that uses students at their help desk and are using this tool to quickly troubleshoot. Again, it's supposed to serve as a full-time troubleshooting expert and save you time. And so we make the process as simple as possible to get you up and running, and have built-in help and troubleshooting scenarios to really understand how to use the product holistically. All right, so with that, I am going to jump into questions around this. The first question is, does the end user connection quality also affect how slow the session loads from the user's perspective? Maybe George, you could give your feedback, and then Yemi, you can talk a little bit about how we show that in the software.
Well, yeah, sorry, what was the question again?
It was, does the end user connection quality also affect how slow the session loads from the user's perspective?
Yeah, so I'm guessing the question is, yeah, if there's a poor connection from the user side, would it impact, you know, logon times and so on? And yeah, it would. So it would almost seem like the logon is taken slower, and that's probably because you're seeing lags. But I also like to make note that the logon process, to me, isn't just about clicking on an application icon and waiting until you get keyboard and mouse control. I like to think of the whole entire logon process is from the moment you launch, for example, Internet Explorer, and maybe you're connecting to Citrix Gateway. So how long does it take that gateway splash page to load? How long does it take to authenticate and enumerate your apps, right through to clicking on the application, and then seeing your desktop, and obviously getting keyboard and mouse control. So yeah, if your connection quality is not, you know, up to speed or up to scratch, then yeah, the entire process will appear slower.
George, I think that is a very good point. Sorry, Stacey. George, I think it's a very good point, because from a user perspective, logging on into Citrix isn't from when, you know, they click on the application. It takes all of those other things into consideration. So that's a very good point. And to drill down and answer that question, from Goliath's point of view, it absolutely does impact, right, the logon process for the user, because it all sort of starts with the ICA file. And if the ICA file takes a really long time to download, even though it's very small, that could impact the user's process. That could impact handing over keyboard and mouse control to the users as well. So having a poor connection speed at the user's location will impact the user session. So it is important to have that connection speed metric here, as we showed in the technology. This connection speed metric is going to tell you whether or not the user has a poor connection, which could add delays into a number of the different stages of that logon process.
Great. Yemi, this next one's for you, I think. Is your system capable of expanding what happens during the interactive session portion of the logon process?
Yeah, so that's a really common question. Of course, I know Citrix has historically not been able to give us any information as into what is actually happening within the interactive session time. At the moment, there's sort of 3 stages of the interactive session time, which would be the pre-user initiation, user initiation, and any delays and things like that happen there. So what our technology will do is break down everything that goes into the process. What we've seen is that, a lot of times, and I can flip back over the technology to show a little bit of a visual here, but what we've seen in the user's logon process is that when it comes to the interactive session time, there are a lot of things that are actually happening simultaneously. So here you can see that in this case, group policies are actually happening at the same time as sort of the interactive session time being calculated. So if you can cut down your group policy processing time, that can end up removing some time from your interactive session time. And of course, I think the number one thing that impacts that will be VM resources and hypervisor host resources for the time frame of the session. So it's important that you're able to keep those VM resources and resource utilization low during those processes on those machines, so that that time is down even further. We have some more documentation on interactive session time and troubleshooting, of course, but because we have a holistic view of the environment, you have everything at your fingertips to be able to take a look at, remediate, and sort of drive that time lower.
Great. The next one I can actually take. It's how is this priced? So our pricing model is very simplistic. It's really based on what are the number of sessions that you want to be able to troubleshoot and or monitor, as well as any other IT elements, whether it be the VMs, the servers, endpoints themselves. As I showed earlier with the different logos we have pricing that scales for smaller to larger organizations. We've also got several promotions going on, recognizing with COVID-19, it's put many strains on organizations that are trying to budget for projects that simply were unbudgeted. So my ask is, do not let price get in the way. We're happy to have a conversation, but holistically, we price by what we're actually monitoring and troubleshooting, whether those be sessions or IT elements. There's 2 questions that kind of go together. So George, I might ask for your perspective first, and then Yemi. The simple question is, how's Goliath different than Director? But a more specific question then that also came through related to that is there a good option for using ADM or Director for finding a deeper dig into session startup section and the session details? For example, to find an error in policy. So George, maybe you could give your thoughts on that and maybe even advise if there is something that they could use for that issue. And then Yemi, I know this is one we've answered quite frequently on our webinars.
Just the second point of the question is there any way to use ADM and Director to get, feedback on maybe any issues with group policy? Do you want me to take that one, or do you want me to sort of comment on?
Yeah. Yeah,
I'll take
maybe can you take that, and then any comment on the larger scale question as well?
Yeah, so Citrix ADM, for example, it's a monitoring and management appliance for your NetScalers, which are now known as Citrix ADC. So they don't touch or look into your logon times in any aspect. Basically, they will report on latency, so how much latency you have from your maybe home device to the data center network, and also report on latency from the data center, which is the gateway device in your data center, to the VDAs, which reside on all your hypervisors. So obviously, if there is high latency, it can result in a slower logon, but it doesn't actually specifically look at how long it took to process group policy and so on. Director does do that. I would say at a fairly basic level. So you've got your Logon performance metrics that are captured by Director, and it reports on things like how long it took for the HDX session to establish, how long it took for group policy processing, how long it took for Logon scripts and so on to run. But it doesn't necessarily tell you if there was an issue with group policy. For example, maybe there's a particular group policy that's taking 30 seconds or more. It's not going to point that out. It might tell you overall that group policy processing is taking a long time, but it's not going to say actually it's this one here that you need to look at. So you will, and in a typical enterprise environment, there could be 20 or plus different group policies that can be applying to user sessions. So at that stage, it's really up to you to go through that process of elimination, trying to figure out which one it is. So yeah, unfortunately, it's not going to be able to tell you exactly where the problem lies within your infrastructure. The first question, so do you want me to touch on that? If you could repeat it, please.
It was just holistically, how does Goliath differ from Director? So just George, maybe a minute or two thoughts on when there is a need for a purpose-built tool like Goliath, and then Yemi can answer specifics. But I know we spent many times talking about where there becomes a need for a purpose-built tool. Yeah,
I guess Citrix Director is a free tool. Everyone probably uses it. They probably deploy it because it's there, and obviously it has some cool features there that you can view user sessions and view average logon times and see how many people are logging on, and so on. I think when it comes to purpose-built monitoring tools, I think you just get a deeper breadth of information from those tools. So we've already sort of touched on Goliath and how it can capture multiple different metrics about a user session, and we've seen that it can calculate how long it takes literally to obtain the ICA file via storefront when you go to click on that icon. So yeah, the purpose-built tools, obviously they generally delve further into your environment, and also it can look at things outside of the Citrix environment, where Director would generally focus on Citrix products. The purpose-built monitoring tool will tend to go outside of that and look at Active Directory and other things, and be able to tell you if there's issues on the network. So we really get a lot more information there, and all that data feeds into a powerful reporting tool as well. So you can generate all sorts of different reports, either for yourself, for management, or for third parties.
Yeah, George, I think you hit that directly on the head. Citrix Director, and we actually have this slide that really breaks that down. Director is going to monitor all of these components here that are sort of inside, that aren't red, of course, but as we know, there are a lot of other things that impact the user experience and impact Citrix. So the devices, the network components, any other backend systems like SQL database, Active Directory, your hypervisor host platforms, user connectivity at their location. So a tool like Goliath, Goliath is going to pull in and monitor end-to-end all of the components that you see here on the screen, to give you that true end-to-end visibility. And the other thing that I think we hear from customers is the historical data and reporting, which you mentioned as well. Being able to see historically the performance of the components, user experience, etc. And then to show what has changed in the environment that could be positively impacting the environment or negatively impacting the environment. So those are the two major points that I think I'd point out as the differences between Goliath and a tool like Director or ADM.
So Yemi, there's a couple questions that kind of came in during that. I think some you've answered, right? One was asking, can you pinpoint an issue outside Citrix, like a database? I think this shows you absolutely, right? That's the key differential for Goliath, that we can look at all those endpoints and potentially alert if there is an issue or identify it as root cause. Also kind of related to that, there was a question around, is there a macro view of the entire Citrix infrastructure that you monitor? I thought maybe if you had it, could you bring up the automatic discovery map and talk to it for a bit?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I have that here on the screen. So this is our automatic discovery and dependency map view for Citrix. And this will automatically map out all the components, discover and map out all of the components that contribute to Citrix in your environment. So question about database, the delivery controllers, the storefronts, and things like that. Map them out, and then add over 300 monitoring rules to the environment. So you're going to be monitoring for conditions, failure points, thresholds, and events that can actually cause end user experience issues if they're not taken care of. So we talked about focusing on or alerting on resource utilization, alerting on user experience issues and things like that. But we're also alerting on, components or services, core services on your delivery controllers and storefronts and licensing servers. So if there's any issues that take place, you are getting a real-time alert, and you're able to see all of that in this sort of live updating knock screen to be able to investigate. But you can also take it further, though, with the delivery layer, where you can see all of your delivery groups, machine catalogs, gold images, if those are available. Again, with that knock screen capabilities because of the embedded intelligence and alerts, and even drilling into a particular delivery group, you can now see information about that delivery group from a resource utilization perspective, user experience, all tied back down to the components. So I can see user experience, average user experience on my machine catalog, my hypervisor cluster, down to the hypervisor host itself. So if there are components that have issues that are driving poor performance, I'm able to not only be alerted to those things in a sort of an aggregated view, in an aggregated way, but I'm also able to get a knock view of that so I can quickly pinpoint those problem components and remediate very quickly.
Great. And I know we're slightly over, but there's one other question that came in, Yemi, I think specific to you. Is it possible to eliminate any part of the interactive session when in particular that's causing slow connectivity?
Is it possible to eliminate portions of it for the logon process? Mm-hmm. I'm not quite sure. I think I think George, you might have some additional insight here, but I'm not quite sure if you can eliminate those things because those are all happening in the back end side for on Citrix for the session host. However, having technology on that session host that's able to drill into resource utilization, anything from Windows perfmon, the event log level, and things like that can help identify if there are any issues taking place in your environment that you need to take a look at that are impacting the interactive session time. But I'm not sure if you could, I'm not sure if there is any ability to eliminate processes that are happening within that interactive session time, because that I think would impact the user's ability to use their sessions. George, did you have any insight there?
I mean, I would agree. I don't know how much you can do to eliminate or reduce that without maybe breaking something, which would be the short answer to that. I mean, just one of the things I would I would say to reduce interactive session time is to, on your image, obviously optimize it as much as possible. You've got the Citrix optimizer there that can help. And also just try and install, this might sound a little silly, but try and install as little as possible on the image, because the less software you have running, the less processes that are actually going to be running on that desktop, which will reduce interactive session time inevitably. When I say install as little as possible, it basically means, sometimes I see environments that have installed software for end users, and then maybe that software is no longer used, but the software has actually never been uninstalled, so it just sits there and it's never used, but it's taken up memory and RAM basically. So yeah, that's what pretty much I mean by that.
Great. Well, thank you both, Yemi and George. That's the end of our questions. And thank you to everyone that listened today to today's webinar. As I mentioned, you will get the recording in your inbox. And if this is something you're interested in, we do offer free trials. Just email techinfo@goliathtechnologies.com and we can get you set up in a free trial. Or we're also happy to answer any additional questions that may have come up during the session today. Again, George, thank you so much for your expertise, and best of luck as you continue to support your organization and all the changes that are happening in today's remote work styles. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.